Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's July 22, 2021, and today we're bringing you a recording of a seminar held at the Myanmar Update Conference last week. This talk is by Mike Dunford, a PhD candidate at the School of Culture, History and Languages at the Australian National University. Mike's topic today is the heterogeneity of the Civil Disobedience Movement in Myanmar, and he makes a number of bold claims that are sure to further the scholarly debate on the role of the Tatmadaw in Myanmar, on colonisation in Southeast Asia, and on the configuration of resistance against the 1st February 2021 coup. It's a great talk, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Mike, who answers two brief questions at the end of his talk.
I want to begin by acknowledging that the tens of millions of people currently in Myanmar have gone through not one, but at least two macro-scale traumatic events in the last year. And this is on top of the daily traumas and daily pain inflicted on more local or individual scales. And here I'm not only thinking of the coup, but also the current crisis with the COVID-19 Delta variant. I know, because I have access to the back end of Zoom, that there are hundreds of people from Myanmar listening right now who have likely all experienced some of the pain and frustration around these events, and many Myanmar people tuning in from overseas who are struggling with the added frustration of not being able to return home due to the current travel restrictions. I don't want to add to your pain or your trauma. So with that in mind, I'd like to forewarn everyone listening right now that this paper will quite directly discuss violence and death. So just a heads up. So I don't wish to add to your pain. The Q&A will begin in about 20 minutes. So by now, everyone listening to this talk probably knows the rough outline of events that took place in February. On the 1st of February, the Tatmadaw staged a coup that overthrew the democratically elected government of Myanmar, to the dismay and heartbreak of vast swaths of the population. Almost immediately, an anti-Tatmadaw public began to make itself visible, and from 8 p.m. every evening, also extremely audible. Within a few days, nurses and doctors began a public sector strike. The nurses and doctors were quickly joined by teachers and other education staff, and in about 1 week, the public sector strike became a generalized but totally peaceful anti-Tatmadaw uprising across huge swaths of the country, and the civil disobedience movement grew into its present form. In the months that have followed, CDM, the acronym for the Civil Disobedience Movement, has become a kind of shorthand for one's political allegiances. This has led to some confusion in the way that anti-coup protests and actions have been characterized. In the case of government staff, CDM participation is explicitly linked to whether someone is striking or not. For example, staff can be referred to with pride as CDM or ridicule as non-CDM. If someone is referred to as non-CDM or is still working, the implication is that they might possibly be pro-coup. At the same time, the phrase CDM has been used to refer to the entire anti-coup movement in Myanmar and not just striking workers. A nice illustration of this dual meaning is in Yangon's famous taxi protest, which took place in mid-February. Huge numbers of cars parked at crucial traffic junctures in Yangon, I'll bring up a photo of this a little bit later, which brought the city to a near standstill. So this was sometimes described as enabling CDM, which is to say enabling workers to strike by making it impossible for them to get to work in the first place. And it was sometimes described as taxi CDM, meaning that the actions of the drivers and other motorists were part of the civil disobedience movement in their own right. So for the purpose of this presentation, I take the civil disobedience movement to include both of these elements: the striking public sector and eventually also private sector workers whose actions bravely brought the country to a near standstill, and the various groups who support them, including the public protesters against the coup or against the Tatmadaw more generally. So, as I mentioned earlier, the civil disobedience movement emerged with healthcare workers who sparked a wave of public sector strikes across the country. They were quickly joined by teachers and eventually by enormous groups of people from all occupations, as you see here in central Mandalay. On some occasions, elements within the repressive state organizations supported or at least abetted the civil disobedience movement. This is one of my favorite photos from the early days of the anti-coup protests. So here you can see a police officer playing along with the taxi protesters and other motorists who claimed to have engine trouble and blocked most of Yangon's major junctions. So here's the police officer asking, what's wrong with your car? How can I help fix it? Another one of my favorite protest actions was the so-called Tamim protest, in which protesters deployed a gender taboo about the power of women's garments to damage masculine power, or POM. So any soldier believing in the efficacy of POM would have been unable to enter, for example, this street until the garments were removed. However, crucially, it should be noted that any man who takes his POM seriously would have also found this troubling or confronting entering this street. These strikes and protests were accompanied for calls by a new state structure in Myanmar from a range of different political perspectives. And sometimes these perspectives have actively competed with one another. So on one hand, there was an enormous number of people calling for the installation of the democratically elected government, which has come to be known as the Committee Representing the Pyidansu Hluttaw, or CRPH. But on the other hand, some supporters of the General Strike Committee, or the General Strike Committee of Nationalities, groups which are also internally diverse, tended to call for a more complete overhaul of Myanmar's political system rather than the acknowledgement of the government that was elected last November. Organizations who have historically been hostile to any state structure in Myanmar, even under the former NLD-led democratically elected government, such as the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, whose secretariat is pictured here, have also come out in support of the civil disobedience movement. So you'll notice that the PSLF-TNLA secretariat is giving the three-finger Hunger Games salute, which originated as a anti-authoritarian protest sign in Thailand and Hong Kong, but has been taken up by the civil disobedience movement in Myanmar. For the moment, tensions between the CRPH supporters and those who support a more total overhaul of Myanmar's governance structures have led to the formation of the National Unity Government, or NUG. But at the same time, People's Defense Forces have emerged across the country. And these are grassroots militias who engage in guerrilla tactics such as targeted bombings and killings, and sometimes in more direct and slightly larger scale assaults on Tatmadaw installations. So this is a group from Damu Sagaing Division. These protests are ongoing. The people who form them and the values that they support remain as diverse as they were when the protests started. There's only one position that every person across every incarnation of the civil disobedience movement supports, which is an end to the military coup and more broadly, an end to Tatmadaw rule in Myanmar. So the point here is that the civil disobedience movement contains a wide array of claims, values, and goals, which are occasionally internally contradictory. What brings the various actors of the civil disobedience movement together are the common targets they address with their claims and actions. The post-coup Tatmadaw-led state on one hand, who they critique and refuse, and private individuals throughout Myanmar on the other hand, who are tacitly or explicitly asked to join the movement. The CDM then constitutes a kind of public, but one very different from the Habermasian bourgeois public, whose main mode of address is polite conversation and rational debate. The civil disobedience movement is a public whose venue is the streets and whose goals are not articulated through rational discussion, but through direct action and active protest. These acts of protest are highly heterogeneous in content and in form. I draw attention to the heterogeneity of the civil disobedience movement in order to clearly understand how it contrasts with what it opposes, namely the leaders of the coup. To that end, this paper makes two central claims, which are interrelated. First, although the Tatmadaw is a post-colonial entity, it ultimately relies on colonialist political formations. By contrast, the anti-Tatmadaw publics who have appeared under the broad rubric of the civil disobedience movement are best understood as properly anti-colonial. Second, I'll argue that the apparent fractiousness and heterogeneity of the civil disobedience movement should be understood as one of its key strengths, rather than a problem to be overcome or a weakness to be fixed or resolved. The sheer diversity of actors and values within the civil disobedience movement is what could prevent it from being simply absorbed into a Tatmadaw-led hegemonic political formation in the longer term. So I'm certainly not the first person to point out that the Tatmadaw relies on colonial technologies of governance. I was first made aware of that point while reading Mary Callahan's Making Enemies. However, I want to revisit Callahan's claim about the colonial heritage of the Tatmadaw in light of the current political situation in Myanmar post-coup. To do that, I'd like to bring Mary Callahan into dialogue with Kwansing Chen. Chen calls for a reevaluation of the political and cultural legacy of colonialism and imperialism in East and Southeast Asia that suggests that those processes did not end. Where Callahan enables us to understand the historical lineage of state violence in Myanmar, Chen enables us to trace the political and cultural implications of this historical lineage for the publics who have to live with the post-colonial but still very violent and repressive state. For Chen, the act of deposing overlords from abroad, so in the case of Myanmar, the act of deposing the British or the Japanese, cannot be the endpoint of cultural and political decolonization. Decolonization requires further work, even after the foreign overlords have been ousted. Colonial politics are first and foremost a politics of violent domination. As long as a state relates to its constituents through a politics of violent domination, that state cannot be said to have been decolonized. To explain what I mean by violent domination, I'm going to borrow terminology from Dipesh Chakrabarty, who is also borrowing, he's borrowing from Foucault. I'm borrowing from Chakrabarty, who's borrowing from Foucault. For Chakrabarty and Foucault, the politics of domination should be understood in contrast to what they term the politics of sovereignty. A politics of domination is a politics in which the public is willing to risk death to overthrow the ruling regime. Politics of sovereignty, by contrast, is a politics in which the public is willing to live with a regime, even a repressive or violent one. As Chakrabarty argues in the case of India, the politics of domination was the political mode established during the British colonial years, and its echoes are still felt in Indian public life in the way that the public relates to the state. I argue that this same formulation applies to the relationship between the Tatmadaw and the publics who oppose them, especially now in the post-coup political climate. If the People's Defense Forces and the frontliners of the ongoing protests are any evidence, there is certainly a public in Myanmar who is willing to risk everything to overthrow the Tatmadaw. Colonialist political formations always begin with dominance and never fully let go of it as a political strategy. Extreme violence is always a possibility inside any colonial political formation, even if after it has established sovereignty and the public is no longer willing to risk death to overthrow the regime in question. A political regime or a political formation can move back and forth between these forms of politics. A colonialist organization like the Tatmadaw attempts to establish sovereignty through the absorption of the values put forth by the public whose interests they claim to represent. We know that's a lie, but I'm borrowing the term absorption here from Luke Boltanski and Yves Chiapello. So for Boltanski and Chiapello, absorption is what happens when an organ of power, so in their example, a corporation, but in my example, a violent state, responds to critique by taking on some of the values of its critics, thereby reducing the efficacy of further protest. Crucially, absorption in this way only works when the demands made in the critique form a very readily identifiable set of values that are basically cohesive, and when those values do not threaten the fundamental composition of the power structure in question. So for Boltanski and Chiapello, this is why they believe that the labor movement no longer works. If you're an Uber driver, you control your day, you have flexible hours, you have a flexible working situation, but you are ultimately still subject to the same domination by a corporation as you would working anywhere else. The heterogeneous actors that form the civil disobedience movement have one central value in common, which is the end of military occupation of Myanmar, and in many, if not most cases, the end of the Tatmadaw itself as an institution. Apart from that one core value, the claims made and the stances taken by the huge range of civil disobedience movement participants are specifically not cohesive across time and space. From my perspective, this diversity and apparent lack of cohesiveness is more of a strength than a weakness. The heterogeneity of the civil disobedience movement will prevent it from being absorbed by a more conciliatory Tatmadaw that has not been decolonized, which is to say, a Tatmadaw that is still the violent fascist organization that we all know it to be. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Mike had two questions from the audience. The first was, you mention heartbreak. Is heartbreak doing any analytical work in your research? In Myanmar, what was the political heart attached to and what broke?
Thank you very much for that question. I was not using heartbreak as an analytic, but now that you've put the idea in my head, I'm interested in it. I personally felt heartbroken watching friends and family descend into despair, and have felt a lot of it myself, and that was as far as it went in terms of using it in the presentation. Thank you.
Mike's second and final question was, do you think your reflections on absorption also apply to the NLD government before the coup in 2021? If yes, then how?
Yeah, my nightmare was that someone would ask me this question, and here it is. I don't want to belittle the accomplishments of the NLD in 2015, but I think the short answer to this question is yes, definitely. And we have seen the proof of that in the fact that the coup occurred. In some ways, the coup is evidence that the power sharing arrangement established that began, I guess, 2010 or possibly earlier, but that really came to the fore in 2015 was quite tenuous and was still on the terms of the Tatmadaw.